Our fifth anniversary fell on a Thursday in April. I remember the date because the lilacs had just come in along the fence line, and I had cut a few stems and put them in a jar on the kitchen table, which was the closest thing to a decoration I owned. I had made a special supper: roast chicken, mashed potatoes with cream from our own cows, a pie I had started at 4 in the morning so it would be cooled and ready by evening. I had put the children to bed early. I had changed into my second dress, the better one, the one I saved for church and funerals. I had done all of this because I knew what our anniversary meant to Jonas. And I thought, foolishly, that if I did everything right, what came after supper would feel like something I was giving freely, instead of something I was bracing to survive. I was wrong. And what happened that night, in the silence after the children were asleep and the plates were cleared and the kitchen was dark, is something I have never told anyone the full shape of. Until now. Before I go any further, I need to say something honest. More than 90% of the people watching this right now have not subscribed yet. And I understand that. Maybe you stumbled here tonight without quite knowing why. Maybe something in the title caught at you, some memory you have been carrying quietly that you did not expect to find reflected back. But if you are still watching, if something in this story is already pressing against something inside you, I hope you will subscribe and stay. It is free, and it keeps these stories, the ones that were never supposed to leave the farmhouse, alive. And while you are here, I want to ask you something in the comments. Have you ever done everything right and still felt like it was not enough? Tell me below. I read every word. Now let me tell you what our 5th anniversary actually cost me. My name is Martha, and this is Hannah, the Amish girl, the channel where the stories no one was ever supposed to repeat finally get spoken out loud. I grew up Old Order Amish in Geauga County, Ohio. I married at 19, I left at 26. And between those two ages, I learned things about marriage that no one in my community would ever say plainly from the front of a room. Things that lived instead in the spaces between words, in the quality of a silence, in the particular way a man's shoulders set themselves at the supper table when the evening ahead has not yet gone the way he expected it to go. I need to tell you something about how anniversaries worked in our community before I can tell you what happened on ours, because you need to understand the framework before you can understand what was built inside it. In the outside world, an anniversary is a celebration. Two people look back at the years they have built, and they mark the passage of that time together. A dinner, perhaps, a gift, a conversation about what the marriage has meant. The day belongs to both of them equally. In our community, an anniversary was something else. It was not spoken of publicly, the way most important things were not spoken of publicly. But among women, in the quiet language women use when they are telling each other the truth without ever quite saying it directly, the meaning of an anniversary was clear. An anniversary was a night when a husband's expectations were at their highest, and a wife's only safe response was to meet them, fully, without complaint, without tiredness, without the shadow of anything that had happened in the week before. A wife who let an anniversary pass without giving her husband what he considered his due was a wife who had made a statement. And statements, in our world, were dangerous things. I knew this. I had known it since before I was married, the way Amish girls know all the things they are never directly taught. Through watching, through listening, through the careful silences of older women who had already learned. So I prepared. I want you to stay with me here, because this is the part that most people on the outside never quite understand when I try to explain it. The preparation itself was a kind of compliance. The special supper, the early bedtimes for the children, the better dress. Each of those choices was not a choice exactly. It was a translation. It was me saying, in the only language the community had given me, I know what tonight means, and I am going to meet it. I am going to be a good wife. What I have not told you yet is what was happening inside my body that April. 3 weeks before our anniversary, I had lost a pregnancy. We did not call it that in our community. We did not have a ceremony or a period of mourning. What we had was a week of bleeding and pain and the quiet disposal of something that had briefly been the beginning of a person. And then the expectation that I would return to my regular duties because the farm did not stop for grief, and neither did the household. And neither, apparently, did a husband's calendar. I had told Jonas. He had nodded. He had said he was sorry. He had gone back to the barn. And we had not spoken of it again. So on the night of our anniversary, I was 3 weeks out from a loss that had never been given a name, still tender in my body in a way I could feel with every movement. And I was setting a beautiful table with lilacs in a jar and a pie I had started at 4 in the morning, because I knew what the night was expected to hold, and I knew what it would cost me to let it pass any other way. Here is the thing I need you to hold on to, because it is the thread that runs through everything I am about to tell you. I did not tell Jonas how I was feeling. I want you to understand why, because it is not a simple answer. It was not that I was afraid he would be angry. Jonas was not an angry man in the way people outside sometimes imagine when I tell these stories. He never raised his hand. He never shouted. His control was much quieter than that, and in some ways much harder to name, which is exactly why it took me years and a therapist's careful vocabulary to find words for it. I did not tell Jonas how I was feeling because I already knew what would happen if I did. Not from guessing, from experience. I had learned in 5 years of marriage that when I named my own pain in a way that interfered with what Jonas expected, the response was not cruelty. The response was a particular quality of stillness. A withdrawal so complete and so quiet that the whole house changed temperature around it. The children would feel it without knowing what it was. The meals would be eaten in silence. The days would pass in a gray cold that lifted only when I found my way back to what was expected of me. And on an anniversary, with the community's eyes on the shape of our marriage even from a distance, the cost of that cold would be higher than I could afford to pay. So I set the table. I served the supper. I listened to Jonas talk about the fence line he needed to repair and the price of milk that season and the cow that had been off her feed. I nodded. I smiled the smile I had learned. I cleared the plates. I checked on the children. And when the kitchen was dark and quiet, and Jonas looked at me in the way that meant the evening had moved from supper into its next requirement, I did not say what I was feeling. I said nothing. I followed him upstairs, and I gave him the anniversary our community said a husband was owed. I want to stop here because I know some of you are waiting for me to describe what happened next in a way that confirms the shape of the story you may already have in your head. I am not going to do that. Not because it wasn't hard, not because the details don't matter, but because the detail that matters most is not what Jonas did. It is what I did afterward. Afterward, I lay still beside him in the dark, and I counted the sound of his breathing slow into sleep. And when I was certain he was gone under, I got up, very quietly, the way you learn to move in a house full of sleeping people. I went downstairs in the dark. I sat at the kitchen table where the lilacs were still in their jar, already beginning to drop their petals onto the wood. And I sat there for a long time in the dark, and I thought about a word I had never heard in our community. A word I would not find for years, not until I was outside and sitting across from a therapist who gave me words slowly, one at a time, the way you feed someone who has not eaten. The word was grief. Not for the pregnancy, though that was there too, underneath everything, like a low sound you feel more than hear. Grief for a different thing. Grief for the version of this night that existed somewhere in my mind, in some other world, where a woman who had lost something small and precious 3 weeks ago could say, "I am not ready tonight," and have that be enough. Where the anniversary could be marked some other way. Where what she had already given, the supper, the pie, the lilacs, the careful performance of a woman at peace, could be accepted as the gift it was, without the expectation of more. That version of the night did not exist in my world. I had given the grief a shape that night without meaning to, sitting in the dark with the lilacs dropping their petals. And I have carried that shape ever since. What I did not know then, sitting at that kitchen table, was that what happened on our anniversary had a name in the outside world. Several names, actually, that my therapist gave me years later. Coerced marital compliance. The weaponization of silence and community expectation as consent substitutes. A yes manufactured by the systematic removal of every safe number. In our community, none of those words existed. We had only one word for what a wife gave her husband on their anniversary. We called it her gift to him. The gift. As though it had been chosen freely. As though she had wrapped it herself and tied the bow herself and placed it in his hands of her own accord. I want to tell you something about Jonas, because I have promised myself I will not tell this story in a way that makes him a monster. Because that would be a lie, and I have told enough of those. Jonas was a man who had been taught, from boyhood, by his father and his bishop and the entire architecture of our faith, that a wife's body belonged to him after marriage. He had been taught that her willingness was guaranteed by God's design, and that her reluctance, when it appeared, was a spiritual problem that reflected poorly on the health of the marriage. He had been taught that an anniversary was a marking, a reaffirmation of the covenant, and that a husband who did not claim that reaffirmation was a husband whose authority over his household was in question. He was not cruel. He was a man living perfectly inside the instructions he had been given. And that, I think, is the most important thing I can say about the system. The cruelty was in the instructions, not in the man. The instructions were the cage. Jonas just lived there too, in his own way, smaller than either of us knew. I left the following year, not because of the anniversary, because of the accumulation. The way a body learns over time to carry more than it can hold, until one morning you wake up and the weight has become the shape of your life, and you realize you have been waiting for a door. And there is a door. It is small, and it costs everything you have ever known. But it is there. I walked through it at 26, with 3 children and a suitcase, and a silence so heavy I could feel it pressing behind my eyes for months. The shunning came the way it always comes, quietly, completely. My mother's letters returned. My sisters looked the other way. The community sealed itself around the space I had left the way a scar seals over a cut, clean and permanent, and with no memory of what was underneath. But here is what I carried out with me. Here is what no shunning can take, because it lives somewhere past where the community can reach. On the night of our 5th anniversary, sitting at the kitchen table in the dark with the lilacs dropping their petals and my husband breathing upstairs and my body still holding its unnamed grief, I knew the difference between what I had given and what had been taken. I knew it the way my mother had once told me you would always know it. In the garden, with her dirty hands and her voice so low I had to lean toward her to hear. The two kinds of yes. I always knew which one I was giving. And because I knew, I was never entirely theirs. They had the body. They did not have the knowing. And the knowing was the thing that eventually walked me out the door. If you have ever lain still in the dark and given something you did not have left to give, and called it love because that was the only word available, I see you. If you have ever prepared a beautiful table and a special supper and a pie that started at 4 in the morning and dressed in your best and called all of it a gift, when what it really was armor, I see you. If you have ever sat in a dark kitchen afterward, alone with something you could not yet name, counting the sound of a sleeping man's breathing, and feeling the full, unbearable weight of a yes that was never really yours to give, I see you. You were not weak. You were surviving inside a structure that had been built, carefully and theologically and over generations, to make sure that the cost of your no was always higher than the cost of your yes. That is not your failure. That is the failure of every hand that built the structure and called it holy. Our 5th anniversary was a Thursday in April. The lilacs dropped their petals onto the kitchen table while I sat alone in the dark. And I held a grief that had no name yet, and a knowing that did. I did not leave that night, but some part of me began to. Before you go, I want to thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this. I know there are thousands of things you could have been doing with this time, and you were here, with me, with Martha, with all of this. That means more than I have a clean word for. But I want to say one thing before you leave. More than 90% of the people who watch these videos still have not subscribed. And if this story reached something in you tonight, if it touched a memory or a grief you have been carrying without a name, or if it showed you something true about a world you never knew existed, I hope you will subscribe. It costs nothing, and it keeps these stories, the ones that were never supposed to leave the farmhouse, alive a little longer. And before you go, tell me in the comments, have you ever given something you did not have left to give and called it love because no other word existed? I want to read what you carry. Until next time, remember this. A yes that costs you everything is not a gift. It never was. And no anniversary, no covenant, no quiet man breathing in the dark above you gets to call it one.